Masons, to the Rosicrucians, you know, and the underground. He would give lectures after his official lectures in Vienna and elsewhere, even in Berlin, I think, to the Masons after hours. So he had this relationship to the Rosicrucian moment, right? The Rosy Cross, right? And the interesting thing about here is the rose dance here, right? Tanzer. He used the dance here, Tanzer. Don't leap, right? Leap is what Marx actually in volume, I mean, I have a pretty good memory for things like this. In volume 1 of Capital, chapter 5, the end of the transformation of money into capital, the first chapter of that chapter 5, Marx's Capital, he repeats this, you know, in terms of the Aesop fable, you know, in a way. The leap forward, right? The leap over. This is where you leap, right, etc. So you have many, many levels here on this old slogan that comes out of Aesop's fables back in the classical era. You know, what you can do with the fabula narrata, you know, in terms of, you know, building a kind of philosophy. Go ahead, please.
Rose makes me think of the famous line from Shakespeare's Julius Caesar. He bestrides the world like a colossus. That's a line from.
Yes, I mean, I'm sure that's related too. I mean, remember
the world like a colossus, referring to Julius Caesar.
The great book on this, by the way, which I really recommend for people that are interested in the esoteric tradition, right, of knowledge, is John Dee and the Rosicrucian Enlightenment, written by Francis Yates, a great British scholar. It's called the Rosicrucian Enlightenment. John Dee, who was the founder of the Rosicrucian moment, right? The Rosy Cross.
So D-E-E?
D-E-E, right? And the Rosicrucian Enlightenment. And the author is Francis Yates. I recommend this book because it's a kind of, you know, undercurrent history, right? John Dee and the Rosicrucian moment. Now, what is crucial for us is that what Hegel really meant by this for the philosophy of right in taking the fable is the great slogan, the actual is the real, and the real is the actual, or the real is the rational, right? And the rational is the real, which became a proposition that was so full of contradictions as we go forwards, but Hegel basically thought that the state, in his later life, is the full rational realization of the spirit.
Even Prussia.
Yes, exactly. So the real is the rational, and the rational the real. This set of propositions plays out, you know, in terms of a projection, right, into the state. And this was one of the reasons that people like Karl Popper, I want to give you the right wing approach to Hegel as well. Popper and others, the Open Society and its enemies, and a whole tradition of British Cambridge Platonists, as well as the British Hegelian Institute of Greek, criticized Hegel because they thought this is exactly what Nazi Germany was, that the real was the rational and the rational was the real. The fulfillment of this spirit culminated in this, you know, 1933 to 1945 thing. But that's just one reading. To me, it's a massive misreading, but this phrase, the real is the rational, right? And we're going to go over this, you know, next week and further when we get to the section on reason, and the rational is the real. And the reason I start here is because the course is called Reason, Right, Revolution, and Regression. And the reason, in a sense, is Hegel's way of, I think, reflecting on the French Enlightenment, right, and the French Revolution, of course, right? And also at the same time that the revolution is then inscribed in reason. We're going to look at this chapter in which terror, the directoire, you know, the Robespierre, is really basically part of this chapter in reason on the terror and absolute terror, which plays out later in the Stalinist show trials through people such as Merleau-Ponty, Arthur Koestler. You know this history well, that Koestler wrote Darkness at Noon, to which Merleau-Ponty responded, that the Stalinist moment was the real as the rational. Socialism in one country was a necessity, a historical necessity, not an aberration. This is something that they used in terms of justifying. This is in a book called Humanism and Terror by Merleau-Ponty. So this was a debate that was very active in the 1950s that we forget today because we want to push Stalin out of the way. We want to push all the bad parts of so-called communist history. But in a way, this was part and parcel of Hegelian moments, the dialectic at work in history, vis-a-vis reason. So I bring this up. This is a very, very controversial. What is the rational, right? What is reason in history? Vis-a-vis what Hegel calls the actual, right? So the here is the actual. This is where you leap in the actual into the timeliness of the now. So this is always what he's trying to do, right? Is this leap into reason dialectically? Yeah, you want to say something?
Oh, no. I'm just trying to think.
Okay. I throw this out. So anyway, real in German is not the way we talk about reality. In German, Wirklichkeit, you speak German or you don't? No, okay. The Wirklichkeit means effective reality. It's the work of reality that Hegel is always interested in. It's just not reality per se, as we say in English, or the old knowledge and or the old reality versus appearance dichotomy in philosophy. Right? Hegel is really going beyond that. For him, reality is the effective work of reality on the society and the historical circumstances. He's always thinking this way. So really, in a way, you're dealing with probably, and one of the reasons I think Marx was so attracted and why he created such a stir, is the first philosopher who actually privileges the social being, the social and the historical moment. This is very important to remember. Yeah. In a sense, right? Now, he writes a philosophy of history. He writes a history of philosophy. He writes a philosophy of state, a philosophy of nature, all of these things. So there are many, many levels to this figure. And this to me, to read, maybe one day we can do this. This, to me, is this very subversive text. It's thought of as a bureaucratic order, the philosophy of right. He writes late in his career. Phenomenology, for those of you that weren't here, it's written, published in 1807. He actually completes it the night that Napoleon comes into Jena. Here's the cannon fodder, and he's in Jena. But he's in Berlin here, and the philosophy of right, is written much later. So it's considered a document for state reason, right? So you go through the transition from the family to civil society to the state, of which Marx takes a tremendous amount from. Marx begins with Proposition 232. I'll bring that next week, the contributions to Hegel's philosophy of the state. And this is where he begins his critique of Hegel's idealism, in this work. But to me, this can be read, going back to this Rosicrucian Enlightenment and his relationship to the Rosy Cross, as a kind of manual for workers to organize. It's really a manual of organization. It's almost like an architectonic for the way you should think and organize. So there's a double thing here. One is addressed to the state, double register. One addressed to the formation of the state, and another one addressed to, quote, the artisans and masons of this period. Yes, yeah.
Okay, the last 2 or 3 sentences.
Yeah, okay.
I've lost my place. Are you
Okay.
talking about Hegel or Marx?
I'm talking about both, but I'm really talking about Hegel in terms of the double meaning of a word called in the philosophy of right. I'm sorry that I have a tendency to, explode the margins. But anyway, I want to say that, no, we're focusing on Hegel. When I bring Marx in, it's the relationship too, but I'll always say it's Marx speaking, and I'm sorry for that. It's Marx speaking, in response to Hegel.
Well, please don't apologize.
Yeah. The problem with the tradition, the Marxist tradition to me, is vis-a-vis Hegel. In most cases, it's we just turn Hegel back on his feet, I think there's much more to it than that. You
It's
know,
too simplistic, isn't it?
it is too simplistic, and the inverted world, you know, that you're turning, you know, Hegel back on his feet. He's thinking in his head, only in his head, right? We want to put him back on his feet. That was a metaphor that Marx used, but I think it's well too simplistic, and too many people take it up that way. A simple inversion, you know, doing one back somersault or something is enough to get Hegel back on his feet. It's much more complicated. And what I'm really trying to say here, again, in terms of reading strategy, is you have multiple registers working in a book like the phenomena, the philosophy of right, which means really the philosophy of law, state.
Of what?
Of state, right. The state, yeah. Really ultimately, right? And, you know, this is a very crucial book, yeah, in a way. Your friend Zizek has read this book very carefully. Zizek. He's read this book because he understands the secret police. He understands, you know, the knock on the door. He understands all these state bureaucracies very well. You know, in America, this is not a popular, in North America, not so much a popular read, but in Europe, great attempts to look at this.
I think he advocates more bureaucracy in the project of emancipation. He basically
Yes,
says
well, this is what
we need more bureaucracy. We need
Right.
more repression. He doesn't say more alienation, more repression. That's what he says. But in the sense that to shatter the conventional wisdom of what it means to be free, what it means to be an individual, and so on and so forth, or what organizes ordinary person's desire. And for him, the Emancipatory Project is to set a new cognitive mapping,
Right.
sets and coordinates the average person's desire.
Right.
And he even recycled, I think it was the Hollywood producer in the 1930s who claimed that we need new cliches. He once said, so the new cliche, in a sense, in a way, it's a new normativity, a renewed bureaucracy.
Right. Well, I mean, again, I think that the comparison between a Zizek going there today or a Jameson also putting out the army as being, you know, the ultimate, you know, arbitrator, you know, in terms of a new society, you know, that's a 19th century conception. A lot of this is being borrowed from Hegel's philosophy of right, how one makes a transition from the family to civil society, which is not moral society, it's civil society, cyclic tight, of where there's an ethical set of principles at work, and then how that becomes the state itself, becomes the arbiter of the ethical moment, right? And we're going to talk about that when we get into the film. I'm kind of prefacing, you know, the phenomenology here later on, yeah.
Maybe I'm mistaken.
Yeah.
Is this the work from which the famous phrase, religion is the sigh, the oppressed creature?
No, Marx said
Did he
that.
get it from there, or from Hegel, or that was his own?
I think Marx
wrote
dreamt that to himself. Yeah. The famous thing that religion is the haven for the homeless in a heartless world, or a homeless.
To me, it's totally
It's a sigh of the oppressed. Religion is the opium of the people. Yeah.
To me, it's that notion
Right.
is totally valid. I mean,
Right.
in many respects.
Right. Yeah. Hegel never said anything about religion being
No, he
the
never
opium
did.
because he engages,
He
as
was
we're
an
going to see
idealist, that's
today.
right.
We'll take a look at where we left off with the unhappy consciousness, which is basically Judeo-Christian codes, right? Basically, what's going on there. And Hegel wants to make a plea. We're going to come back around in the phenomenology to the revealed religion, which is basically Christianity, etc. I mean, you know, remember Germany is a very Protestant country. This is from Luther to Hegel. You know, this is very, very, very much the case, you know, at this point. So the Protestantism and this kind of religious order is still there. You know, very different.
Even Goethe was his background, he was a pietist, I read somewhere. You know, the great...
He was a very smart pietist, if that's what
I
he
mean,
was.
he's...
And then, you know, all the German school children, I'm sorry to be this way, but anyway, all the German, not really, but anyway, all the German children had to learn all the names of Goethe's, you know, mistresses. So he wasn't so pious. You know, that was the thing that German school children had to go through. you know, to learn all of Goethe's names of the, yeah. But he was, yeah, I mean, you know, there was that religious, you know, overlap in a way. Yeah, in many ways. Look, this is very interesting because it sets up for our times. I mean, for those of you that read contemporary theory, you know, a group like Deleuze and Guattari in France, right, and the anti-Oedipus movements and some of the postmodernist attempts really are taking the position against Hegel, right, and the totality and the state and all of these things. You know, Zizek is one of the few that goes back to that, of the generation of 68. And they take up the position that Goethe and Hegel are both old men of the state. Whereas it's Kleist in another tradition, Bachofen, you know, and the family, etc., the Athenaeum group of the Schlegel brothers, who are really the avant-garde that move outside of this kind of state thinking. So that's what they want to get through, you know, against. I don't know if you want to call it anarcho thinking. In a way, it may be anarcho in the sense of the anarche, as Rainer Schumann would do it, that without principles, we're moving away from principles. That's what anarchy really is. You know, it's kind of letting go of the principles that have been formed. But at the same time, it's a very interesting divide that you see, that a figure like this massive thinker of the early 19th century, yeah, and you know, what the reaction has been since. So what we plan to do, let me just go with the next 5-6 weeks here. We're going to look at some poetics responses to this as well. We'll look at Marx's response, and then we'll look at how he fits into the contemporary thinking. And there is a new translation by Terry Pinkert of the book that's supposedly an advance on this Miller translation. I have not looked at it yet, but it's out now. Terry Pinkert is the name of the, he's a Hegelian scholar in South Carolina. Yeah. So there's a new translation. Right. Terry Pinkert's the name. He's written many books. He wrote a great biography of Hegel. By the way, Hegel, Hölderlin, and Beethoven were all born on the same day.
What'd you say?
Hegel, Hölderlin, the poet Hölderlin, his very good friend, and Beethoven were all born the same day.
Wow.
Yeah,
What a coincidence.
yeah. That was a big day in world history, huh?
18 what? That was 18 what? That year.
I think 1806. I mean, 1770. I'm sorry. Yeah, 1770. And Hölderlin, you know, went mad. And Schelling, his other friend, they did it, the spirit of liberty. They got in trouble. You know, they were nothing but German police spies. So they had to be very careful what they said. You know, and Hegel was overshadowed by his good friend Schelling for many years in the academy. And this book, in some ways, is a long dialogue at one level with Schelling as well, who wrote on the philosophical, you know, essence of freedom. You know, was much more of a Spinozist, you know, in a sense, much more closer to the philosophy of nature of Spinoza, whereas, you know, Hegel tried to go beyond that, and then he began to develop much more of an audience. So you had these kind of like, you know, conflicts between friends and competitions that were going on. Hölderlin went mad. Some people said he faked it to get out of going to jail, and he just lived his life out in the, you know, the moment. But, you know, Foucault has very beautiful things in Madness and Civilization on this about Hölderlin, and Nietzsche and Artaud are the signposts of our madness. You know, because all three went mad in different ways. One along the period of German idealism, the next at kind of the end of the century, and then the other one, you know, was the theater of cruelty that you probably know, the Balinese theater.
Yes.
Yeah, Antoine Artaud. Yeah. So anyway, but anyway, we're going to, you know, take a look at Hegel again in terms of some of the reactions. That will be both the regressions, right, from Hegel, how this played out, you know, how the totalitarian Hegel emerged, right, as well as, you know, where are we today in this great concept of the world historical spirit? Or as Hegel says, when you read the morning newspaper, it's the morning prayer. He said that in 1803. I read it as the morning comedy, you know, or Marx's 18th Brumaire. Which Marx also, by the way, to talk, going back here, and this is Marx again, this whole thing here is also the Rhodes and the Leap is also played out in the 18th Brumaire, where events in history, first time appears tragedy, the second time is farce. Another book of a little pamphlet of Zizek, right? The first time is tragedy, the second time is farce. So this is a very interesting thing that Marx took up, again, from this as well as the Aesop fable. So anyway, this could be, kind of the beginning, that there is this, Hegel always thought the journey through this and the journey of philosophy was the Bacchanalian revel in which no member is drunk at the end, right? You revel in it, you're able to dance. The ones left standing can dance, right? In his way. Now, a poet, and we're going to read Mallarmé, right, goes mad reading Hegel, right? Rimbaud, the symbolic poetic movement, is another kind of reaction against this. That goes the way of the decolonized Abyssinian moment in his poetry, right? So we're going to take a look at those things too. So anyway, so I don't know how to kind of get you guys up to speed because we did 8 weeks on the first, part. I divided the book into 2 parts. We got up to the section on self-consciousness, and we left off really with the unhappy consciousness. We were looking at historical shapes of consciousness. And this is Hegel's, moment of trying to ground, right, the world spirit in shapes of consciousness, philosophically, the Stoics first, the skeptics, right, and then finally the unhappy consciousness where he leaves off as he makes the transition into reason. So he's doing this after the world-famous master-slave dialectic, or what's really called the lordship and bondage passage. So that's where we left off. We had spent time, I think the last class here was December the 16th. I'm sorry, okay. Shut off the phone. So anyway, but all the lectures are on the Bernie Sanders phone. Yeah. No, it's a Vermont number for Bernie Sanders asking for money. So I should shut it off.
Yes, they call me too.
They call you too. They called you right now too. Yeah, the robocalls. Huh?
I call, I wear my button, so.
Oh, okay, good, cool. All right, yeah. So I'm going to just turn this off so we're not disturbed. All right. So, but anyway, all the lectures from last semester, Josh is very good, as you can see, are up on the YouTube, at the Institute, if you want to catch up that way. Because we started with the preface. We spent 2 weeks with the preface. I outlined the book, right? We spent time on the introduction. We looked at a crucial word, the science, Wissenschaften in German is a very powerful word, the craft of really knowing, a kind of techne of knowing, just not science.
I meant to bring this to your attention.
Yeah, please.
Last,
Yeah.
It said somewhere in the book that the editor, what's his name? The editor recommends reading the work first and then reading the preface. I read it. It's in the introduction.
Okay.
He says that, but he says it's better to try to understand the whole work,
right,
and then read the
okay,
preface, because the preface is a summary.
Well, the preface was written after.
That's why.
So the book is divided into propositions. You have the book with you, or you didn't? Okay, you don't have.
Can I see
okay.
it?
It's
Yeah, this is
it's very demanding.
It's a demanding read. That's what it is.
It's already heavy.
Yeah.
The
It's a brick.
I have this.
It's a brick. Okay,
I
good.
bought it in the Student's Easy Edition.
Students Easy Edition. I don't know what that is. Yeah, okay. All right, good. All right. Okay. Well, that's the farcical aspect. But this is the tragedy, the primary. Right, okay. So, as Al was pointing out, the first 72 propositions are called the preface. He wrote that after completing the work. So it was not written before to introduce you. Then he wrote an introduction, which is proposition 73 through 89, right? Then he goes into the discourse itself, which begins with the journey through sense certainty, perception, force and understanding, those are all consciousness in general categories, and then self-consciousness, in which the master-slave or the lordship and bondage dialectic tension plays out, the struggle for recognition and prestige, the struggle to death, interiorization of the master by the slave, how this works, and then into the three historical shapes of consciousness through philosophical movements, the movement of Stoicism, the movement of skepticism, and then the movement of the unhappy consciousness, which is basically the mediation of the man God, right? In a way, it comes out to be the Judeo-Christian.
Stoics, he talks briefly about the thinking of the ancient
That's the
Stoics
first part,
and
yeah.
Epicureans. Somewhere.
Well, the Epicureans don't really play so much of a role here.
It's a kind
They're
of-
not really the Stoics. The Stoic he's thinking of is Epictetus and the relationship to Marcus Aurelius. And also the Stoic tradition that has ataraxia as a concept, which is the withdrawal from the doctrine. Instead of stepping into the river twice, you just withdraw, you already know that teaching. You know the doctrine already. So there's always a withdrawal by Stoicism. But for Hegel, this does not really move anything. It's kind of like a moment in the history of philosophy. The moment of self-consciousness does not allow for a movement of the dialectic. So, that's why he goes on to the unhappy consciousness, right? So this is something that's important. So that's the first half of the book that we covered, to a degree, except the unhappy consciousness last term. And now we're trying to, go into the next part, which will be reason, spirit, right? And, basically the ethical world, the ethical order, culture, religion, and, the world spirit, etc. So we're going to try to do as much of this as we can and then go on to the reactions, right? That's kind of the idea. We're going to focus on reason itself, right? Yeah, on reason itself. Okay, so this is the idea at this point. What does this real is the rational, and the rational and the real really mean to us today? Obviously we have an irrational world before us. We have a very hard time making sense of it, except as symptomatic, which is, a type of reading, but that might not be enough, at this point, to really only read symptomatically that this is an effect of late capitalism, to use the Trotskyist phrase, or it's the result of the neoliberal order, to use another, tendency, etc. What are we really doing? Or are we in this new epoch of technocratic capitalism? We have no idea where it's going, in the sense of the mining of data, and what will come out, and where is the reason behind that, etc. So I think this is very important for us to keep in mind. But how does this play out dialectically? So one way of approaching it, I think, would be go back to the concept that he uses of alienation. He's one of the first to really use alienation in a very profound way. That we have multiple levels of alienation. One is alienation from nature. That's number one thing in Hegel. This is what consciousness does. This is what we're involved in. Whereas in Schelling, we're more part of nature, like Spinoza thought.
Wait, when
Yeah.
you say Shelley, you mean Shelley?
No, not Percy Blythe Shelley.
Okay.
Schelling, Friedrich Wilhelm Schelling, a German philosopher.
How do you
Who
spell
wrote
that?
SCHELLING.
Yeah,
Yeah, Friedrich Schelling. Yeah,
I haven't read that.
not Percy Shelley, who did a different
Totally.
levels.
Oh, God.
Right. Who actually translated the Symposium from ancient Greek into English. Yeah, he was a monster, Percy. Yeah, the wife was a better writer though.
Oh.
Frankenstein.
Yeah, Mary Wollstonecraft.
Yes, right. Yeah, exactly. John Goodwin's, on political justice, an early emancipatory thinker in England, was her father.
Oh,
Yeah,
yeah.
it's very advanced. Yeah. Anyway, Erasmus Darwin, all these people. So in a way, Hegel's aware of all these people. I mean, they're very much aware of the, English romantics, and, et cetera. But you have a German romantic tradition here that he's fighting against as well. Yeah. So yeah. So there's the alienation from nature, but the real thing for him is the alienation from the spirit, from the Geist. And Geist, as we talked about, this is really the phenomenology of Geist, could mean not only spirit, but some people are now translating Geist as community. Yeah, the spirit is community. This is happening in some of the recent scholarship. Geist as community.
What?
So really the unfolding of the world historical community or the world historical Geist is happening here. And this played out in some ways with the Francis Fukuyama end of history thesis that was advanced on, capitalist triumphalism after this idiot Clinton ruined your country, or before your idiot Clinton ruined your country. I'll say that publicly, I just did. But anyway.
Does the word Geist in German, does it mean primarily spirit, or does it also mean consciousness? Because
No.
most words
No.
have multiple meanings.
Yeah, Bewusstsein is consciousness.
Oh, all right.
Bewusstsein.
Then I'm
Yeah.
still.
I mean, again, we're
I'm still-
translating it into English, and it's not easy because the word spirit in French has wit with it. Esprit
Right.
has a wit with it. It has a kind of, very beautiful kind of play of wit and intelligence working alongside the spirit, moving, in process. Geist is a substantial term, in some ways, which could mean, spirit. I mean, spirit is force.
Esprit in
Right.
French has multiple meanings.
Yes, it does. As does Geist in German.
There's more subtlety.
Right, yeah.
to
No, we're
the French way of
we're
thinking.
backward with philosophical language in the English world, right? We're always subject to this kind of translation, which is problematic, yeah, in a way, yeah. Not that, it did not hurt Charles Peirce's thinking, but he had a different ambition, who I recommend as an American philosopher, and kind of the best of the pragmatists. But anyway, all to say, Hegel, again, if you think of this, the alienation from nature, the alienation from spirit, and of course the alienation from labor. He's well before Marx, and there's a class theory too. He's very good at Stand here as well, as the standing of class in the estates in Germany. He's very good at this. In fact, Marx does not invent class struggle or class relations. Hegel is speaking about this very early on, in his career. So the alienation from labor as well. And we're gonna read maybe crucial sections of the economic and philosophical manuscripts of Marx,
That's a
in which
great
he
book.
engages Hegel, the young Marx at work with Hegel. Since there's so much of this Althusserian move, forget this stuff, we're going to go back and see what some of the stakes are. Yeah, in the young Marx. So you have this whole history of commentary, if you will, and an attempted overturning of Hegel as well, misappropriations, etc. So the signifier Hegel, if you will, as a proper name, is really elicits a tremendous amount of force fields of scholarship and misinterpretations and misapprehensions throughout history. And the last being the end of history thesis, because Francis Fukuyama said the world historical spirit reached its end. It was triumphalism, capitalism, right? This was a way that the New World Order during George Bush's time, 1991, was constructed. This was the new project for the new American century, which Trump is playing out in a different way. Yeah, in a different way, 30 years later. Yeah, but the project for the new American century began with Francis Fukuyama's piece on the end of history, published in Foreign Affairs. Yeah, and then of course, as you know very well, what happened, in terms of, Eastern Europe, and especially in your country, and the, devastation of the old former, Yugoslavian, area, right? And all the conflicts that went on. Yeah, and this was the product of this kind of thinking, because Clinton came to power, 92, right? By the time of the, look at what happened with this, what was his name? Clark, the general, right? That was there, Wesley Clark. This basically killed this country. Basically destroyed, in a way. And everything was programmed and focused upon Milosevic, all his fault, which is completely ridiculous. If you want a good deconstruction of that monthly review, Edward Herman wrote a beautiful 70-page justification for, what happened. you know, from the you know, Serbian position.
Well, capitalism was in full swing back then.
Yes,
Still.
right,
Only
right.
now we are rethinking.
They're rethinking
moving
a
back
little bit, yeah.
Into the
Yeah.
20th century, basically.
Right, right. Costa Rica, huh? He's still doing all kinds of things, huh?
I don't know what he's doing.
Yeah, okay. He's a great figure, and yeah. You know Costa Rica?
I only read about him
Yeah,
in
yeah.
the
He's a
article.
great creative.
I read a review of Underground, and it was a very critical review of the film, which I haven't watched for
Okay.
some reason. I've never
Okay.
watched the film, so
Okay.
I can't really say much.
Yeah. Well, he's done a lot more than that.
Okay,
Yeah,
okay.
a lot more. Yeah, musically, you know, etc. But anyway, yeah. But going back to this again, you know, the levels are always, you know, there's a right-wing Hegelianism that started right after Hegel died or during his later life. There's a left-wing Hegelianism that started with Bruno Bauer, of which Arnold Rug was one of the, you know, facilitators. Engels himself wrote Ludwig Feuerbach and the End of German Classical Philosophy. Classical philosophy was basically Hegel, right? German classical philosophy. So you have this left-wing tradition. And then the Hegelian Marxism kind of comes back around, you know, through Lenin in Russia. It was really the East at that time, you know, geographically related to us, not really me, but anyway, that took up Hegel and certainly Lenin, and before that Plekhanov, who was Lenin's philosophical mentor. So you have this transition, you know, this movement of Hegel into Russia, of which, you know, Lenin once said, those who want to read Marx's Capital and understand it must master Hegel's Science of Logic, right, was his slogan, etc. And then in France had denied the teaching of Hegel for a very long period of time. Everything was Bergson or Emile Bréchier. What was the other guy? What was his name? There was one other, not Julian Benda, he wrote about the treason of the clerks. There was one other professor, but anyway, they were dominant, so Hegel was never really read until the late 20s. So Eric Wilde reread the Philosophy of Right, and then along comes the Russian who goes to immigrate, Alexander Kojève, right? Who gives lectures from 1933 to 1939 on Hegel, which everybody attended, including Jacques Lacan, the psychoanalyst, who got basically his style from Kojève. Kojève was an incredibly charismatic lecturer. You know, everybody was in attendance. Georges Bataille, Sartre, Merleau-Ponty, Lacan, you know, etc., among others, you know, all the major French intellectuals. So this sort of set Hegelian studies forward, whereas in the United States there were very, very little Hegelian studies. The British Hegelians, F.H. Bradley, was the one who wrote a book on appearance and reality, very mild, very pale, or as they say, lame in the vernacular, very lame, Bradley appropriation. So you have these moments, right? And then in the East, you have people after Sartre, Mészáros, István Mészáros. Of course, Lukács in Hungary was the major Hegelian in the East after you know, the Lenin moment, who was educated by the Germans. Dilthey and, you know, Zimmel were his teachers. I'm sorry?
Why were the French reluctant to study? Because of
Brunswick, I'm sorry, I just remembered his
because
name.
of the predominance of scholasticism.
Scholasticism as well, and the Catholicism, of course, Catholicism.
Yeah.
I think also because they were really, I mean, Bergson was an international figure. He was the first great figure in philosophy since, you know, Descartes, really, in a way. Yeah. And so they were protecting also the Bergsonian tradition as well. Yeah. Bergsonian, Durkheimian tradition. But once Hegel came in, he was there to stay, especially after the war, you know. And, you know, Sartre, of course, Merleau-Ponty, all thinking this through, and then, of course, all the way up to, you know, some of the more modern people in France. But in the U.S., the moment really didn't come until the 60s, you know, here at the earliest, and, you know, never really any huge names. I mean, Mark Zwartowski, who was at CUNY, you know, a few other people, a man named Townes, Townes, There are a few other people. Mitchell Franklin, the great lawyer, Roman law, was also again. So never really taught in philosophy departments.
Is John
Yeah.
Dewey considered Hegelian?
He's a pupil of Hegel's, yeah. But I mean, yeah, Experience in Nature could be read as a Hegelian work, yeah, yeah.
Okay.
But an American Hegelianism, yeah,
Mm.
yeah, yeah, yeah. Roebling was a student of the person who built the Brooklyn Bridge. Was a student of Hegel's. He asked Hegel what to do. He says, "Go to the New World. Go home." He wanted to continue to study. And he told him, go to the New World, and he ended up building the Brooklyn Bridge and dying before it was completed by his son. So if you look at the Brooklyn Bridge, and you look at the girders and the way it's structured, you probably know this architecturally, very dialectical in a way. You know, it's very interesting the way that span is working. It's not like these modern stupid bridges. Huh? It has much different level of expertise and thoughtfulness, in my opinion. Yeah, yeah. The blueprint. So anyway, you can see. But yeah, American Hegelianism never really, Pinkert is very good. There are a few commentators that are very good today. But, and then the Hegelian Marxism was taken up mainly by little groups. You had Marcuse when he came. Obviously, the Germans, the Frankfurt School were very influenced by Hegel. Yeah. Certainly Marcuse, Reason and Revolution, which is a book we could look at, alongside of, the Reason and Revolution. Very interesting chapters in there on the social theory of Hegel. And the regressive moment to me is there are many regressive moments, right? We had proliferations, but they only were in spurts with Hegel, very much only in spurts, So there's been a really regressive tendency against the movement of the dialectic since then, dialectical thinking. And those of you that were last night in Arto's class with Yenyoff, thinking dialectically is not in the cards in the United States or in North America. It's about positivism, it's about factual accumulation, it's about teaching to the test, and it's not about relational and dialectical thinking. None of this is really going on. I see it in my students, everybody's complaining about it, of a different generation, and it's just not happening. It's not, yeah.
Does dialectical thinking.
Well, we're gonna have a long talk.
Yeah,
about
because
I'm sorry.
it's tossed around, and I never can get a full grasp of what it's about, this dialect.
Right, I don't think I do either, or anybody really has.
Oh,
But
yes,
it's
you
just,
do.
yeah.
Bertel Ullman, with whom I studied.
Oh, I knew him very well.
He let me
Still
he let me
alive?
study.
Bert was a
Still
best
alive.
friend of my best friend.
Bertel Ullman,
I was
he
with
let
him
me
at
study. He
parties.
let me audit two of his classes, and I met him recently at Rick Wolf's bi-monthly. That's really.
Oh, you go to Judson Church?
Well, no, what I'm saying is that Bertel Ullman wrote two books on dialectic. One is called
Dialectical
The other one
Investigations.
is called The Dance of the
The
Dialect.
Dance of the
And
Dialect.
I think they're
Well,
good
the
books
dance is here.
for amateurs like us. I mean, for people who we're not up to your academic
Whatever.
level.
Yeah.
I think I have both of them. I read the first one. I never got into The Dance of the Dialect.
I think still the best introduction to the dialectic is Marcuse, Note on the Dialectic and Reason and Revolution. And I'll be glad to pass that around.
What?
It's called A Note on Dialectic, and it's in the first edition of Reason and Revolution.
Marcuse.
Of course, it's excluded from the later editions.
Notes on the Dialect?
Note on the Dialectic, a note on the dialectic. It talks about the power of negative thinking. Our problem is we're afraid of negativity and the work of the labor of the negative in the dialectic. This is really what
You mean here,
Yes.
the United
We
States?
don't tarry with a negative to
The
use one
United
of your
States of
friends.
amnesia is where it all falls this country.
We have nothing but the United States of amnesia, right? Exactly.
USA. That's a good definition.
USA.
That's a good documentary.
With Gore Vidal.
Yeah.
Yes,
Yeah,
absolutely.
he wrote 3 popular books on political science, and I haven't read any of his novels, I have to admit, but I did read the 3. They were
It's a
excellent
descendant
books.
of Aaron Burr,
That's
And it's
right.
also a relative of Al
They're
Gore.
great novels. but I-
Tobacco farmers and old American aristocracy.
But didn't he get over it bitter when he got older? Is
I think he was, I don't think it was bitter, I think he was just satirical about what was going on
If
in
you
the
live
United
in
States.
Trunkland, how could you
No,
not
he
be
lived in
bitter?
Italy. He didn't live in
He lived with a
Trunkland.
lover in
He lived in, lived in,
He
well,
never
They
visited
live on top
people.
of a hill.
yeah, they have beautiful, beautiful place in Italy.
Yes.
Yeah, yeah.
And Ravello, Italy, had a villa.
Yeah, yeah,
because
yeah,
that's
anyway,
where he lived
yeah.
with
He was bitter also as
Bible.
younger.
But going back to dialectic,
52 years
I'll do that. I mean, it's a very good introduction to the dialectic, right, in a way. Yeah, I mean, you know, this is a note on dialectic is very good about the power of negative thinking, Marcuse, right? Of course, Adorno writes negative dialectics, which is an attempt to look at the work of the negative in the dialectic through how categories and concepts are formed. And it's really basically a long accounting of Heidegger's system and, you know, Husserl's system in some ways. How the concepts and the categories on ontological need is one of the crucial chapters in that book, how the ontological need is framed. You want to say something?
Yeah, I mean, isn't it? It's also about sort of privileging a moment of negativity over the moment of synthesis or unity.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah. I mean, the thing about Adorno in relationship to the Hegelian dialectic, and this is where it gets interesting, at least to me, that Adorno is basically saying we're not interested in reconciliation.
Right.
And then most of the Hegelians are interested in the synthetic reconciliation of these spirals. The dialectic works for Hegel in a spiraling thing. You unfold, I'm very bad at diagramming, but Josh is good, maybe I should ask him to come up with it. You know, you unfold into a new, you know, every time there's a synthetic ground, you unfold through this process of the Aufhebung, right?
Yeah.
The suppression, the lifting higher, retention, and the moving forward. It's a springing forth, but it's a spiraling type effect where new frameworks are opened each time in a circular fashion, in a very circular
That
fashion.
makes sense. How could it, being stuck in negation, how?
No, you're not stuck in negation.
No, I
Negation
mean,
is the motor.
You mentioned another author who's is against reconciliation.
Well, he's not stuck. He's working the negative through these things. The spheres don't ultimately reconcile.
There's no end.
Yeah, there's no end.
There's no end.
It's
to
an
the
infinite.
dialectic.
It's not teleological.
It's an open dialectic,
Yeah.
so
Oh,
that
yeah.
there is the moment of synthesis, of course,
Right.
and to a degree. But in the moment of synthesis, you're supposed to recognize the violence in bringing the two concepts together, and then basically you're in this perpetual revolution ultimately,
Oh,
in a sense.
Right.
I prefer this.
You prefer reconciliation? Well, you're Christian, huh? You're Christian, see, because the reconciliation is we all end up in the divine, right? Yeah.
Maybe I could try to
Yeah,
sort of
yeah. Yeah,
mediate
please, yeah,
the
mediate, yeah.
the two opposite poles, because my understanding of dialectical negation is, well, in Hegel's language, the negation of negation. So this is not.
Well, there are two forms. There's not only the negation of the negation.
Yeah.
First is the determinate negation.
right.
Through the negation, you know, you're determined.
death.
Yeah. And then you go to the level of the negation.
Yes,
of the negation.
well, in speculative terms,
Right.
what is negated is not simply cancelled out, but it is the recognition that what was previously considered as negative or antagonistic, that position is shifted. So nothing is being killed off or nothing new is added. What is changed is the position, the immanent position of the subject. So
You
what?
mean a better form of negation? Is that, I mean,
A better form of the subject. So what changes is the subject.
I think what you're saying
The-
is
the
that
perspective.
the Setzung, the positing is changed.
Yes.
Because the preceding positing is overcome.
Correct.
By the negation.
So the
Yeah.
new position no longer considers what was previously considered as being antagonistic.
well, that sounds analogous to that. They're not that different.
Yeah, that's the Hegelian dialectic.
That's the Hegelian dialectic at work.
But
A
that.
war machine, though, when you really think about it, because Setzung is war language for positioning. You know, the positing in itself
Okay.
is the position of military. I mean, it has many levels here in in some ways. But go ahead, yeah.
I think I'm done. Yeah.
But do you think, Michael, we could make the distinction
Yeah.
between the Marxist dialectic as method, let's say, and the Hegelian, just in the class over time, maybe, and the Hegelian dialectic? And
Yeah, I mean, I guess we could do that. I mean, the thing is in the economic and philosophical manuscripts, Marx begins to talk about the limitations of the Hegelian dialectic.
Right. And we brought
And
that
in
up
a
in
way,
the last.
but I don't think
yeah.
anybody yet, because there's a lot of still unresolved, thinking about this, really understands what Marx meant by the dialectic.
Yeah.
In a
It's
certain way.
ambiguous, yeah.
It's still very ambiguous, and it's also in a sense of, you have to remember, dialectics is not a standpoint.
Yeah.
It doesn't have anything to do with position or where you're standing. It has to do with movement.
The movement. of
It's
thought.
always the movement,
The
right?
movement of thought.
Yeah, movement of thought in Hegel, but movement of the matter of thought, right?
Because to
In
me,
many ways.
I'm always a little
Yeah.
bit confused because at once I read that Marx totally rejected Hegel in his own words, in a sense. He says it,
Dead dog.
Right.
He uses the metaphor of the dead dog.
And then at the same time, he says I'm a pupil of the master Hegel or something at the same time, right?
Right.
And so, it's very easy for me to get confused. I feel like between when
Well-
this kind of understanding of the Hegelian system, and I'm trying to always apply it to Marx in a sense, and the logic,
Right.
of course, and sort of unwrapping all that. But then at the same time, I know that there is this break, or essentially the proposed break, that he was into something else, and that's when I get a little bit.
Well, one of the breaks, I mean, maybe to be, somewhat simple about it, is between the positing of ideals.
Right.
In Marx's
Ideas
case,
versus
it's
material.
always
Yeah.
the material conditions or the matter at hand.
Yeah.
But Hegel, in his way, is always dealing with the Sache too, the matter at hand. In some ways,
Right.
and they produce an ideality.
Right.
The language of spirit Marx does not use, right?
Right.
Marx is about the language of the commodity, the language of the fetish of the commodity, and then the movement of circuits of capital, right? I mean, this is where the dialectic really takes off. So when I mentioned chapter 5 of the first volume of Capital, the transformation of money into capital, that's a dialectical process.
Yeah.
This is something Hegel is not able to do, because he's not really beginning with the material conditions of the circuit of money, commodity money, of MCM, as a circuit, right? So he's not getting to that circuit of M prime, because his dialectic doesn't really allow him to. It's just an ideality instead of a concrete moment of how money becomes converted into capital, right?
Yeah.
Right? And he has very interesting things to say about that. Maybe I can get some passages of Marx to show this at work. But it's an interesting question, how there is a difference in the dialectic there in many ways. Because dialectic in historical terms, philosophical historical terms, means the art of conversation. This is what Plato meant. In Aristotle, something a little different. Became a relational term, right? In a way. Not only conversation, but relationships between terms, etc. And you begin to see this in the categories and the formation of categories and concepts. Dialectic during the church, there's a dialectic in St. Thomas Aquinas, and there's a synthetic moment between the Aristotelian materialism and the Platonic idealism in the Summa Theologica, where you have disputations, responses, next to, the overcoming of that in the pious tradition.
You said once that Thomas Aquinas is a dialectician.
Yes, he is. The subtle doctor, the subtle doctor was Duns Scotus, but yeah, he was the doctor of doctors, right, in a sense, because he was synthetic. Yes, of course he was a dialectician. He had the whole moment of, this structure of being, really, in a sense. He's the one that sees being as production. Right? Being as providence, being as seen, So this has a very long tradition in a sense. And then the dialectical thinking, you have it in Kant too. You have the difference, and the analytic and synthetic judgments in Kant. And then you see the dialectic of the categories, all this too. But the Hegelian dialectic is a more synthetic, and it presupposes the totality. So the question is, of course Marx is thinking in terms of totalities, right? I mean, the world is an agglomeration or an accumulation of commodities. That's what the world is. It's not human beings. The world is filled with commodities. So therefore we will begin our analysis through the commodity form. And that's a dialectical process.
Yeah.
How does one move from a commodity, convert it into money in order to buy new commodities? So you have this kind of spherical motion going through. What is the distinction between use value and exchange value? Again, dialectical splitting, right? In a sense that certain things have utility, certain things have use, as commodities, right? And now exchange value. The main insight to me of postmodernism, there's no more use value, it's all exchange value. Hence the verb, we monetize. Everybody uses this word. How do you monetize this? Right? This is a new verb that comes out during the last 25, 30 years. Everything is exchange value. It's not about the use of the pen. What can it be exchanged for? What role does it have in the monetizing of something, right? Yeah. So this is another thing that, is happening in our own epoch. But to think this is one great character in fiction, Ivan Karamazov, maybe a saying of Dostoevsky gives you an elementary working definition of what the dialectic does in the modern period. This man, ladies and gentlemen of the jury, can hold 2 points of view simultaneously in his head, right? And can work with that. That was really Dostoevsky's contribution to dialectical thinking. The ability to hold those two positions together simultaneously. And what Josh was referring to in terms of positions in negative dialectics is Adorno is only interested in the antagonistic dialectic. He's not interested in a dialectic that will synthesize or reconcile something. Yeah, he'll look at the synthetic ground,
right,
but at the same time he wants to stay on the side of the antagonistic dialectic. The same thing is going on with such theorists like Negre, especially in the 90s, part of the antagonistic dialectic. We will not participate, from Marcuse's great refusal we will not participate in the performance principle of everyday capitalism. We will participate only in eros, right? The life principle. This is the political fight. For Marcuse, it becomes in Negre and others, the refusal of work, right? The refusal of deadening work, etc. And they put themselves out in terms of an antagonistic dialectic, and they'll write about such books like Time for Revolution, which is propositional logic, although he ends up in a kind of pious position where St. Francis of Assisi becomes one of his models for the future, that kind of love, right, of nature. So you have this kind of nostalgic moment going on there. Adorno, there's no nostalgia. Yeah, thanks.
Book's gonna fall.
Yeah, okay.
You don't know, the other side.
Okay. Oh, yeah, thank you. Yeah. So I mean, in Adorno, there's no nostalgia. That's the interesting thing. I think that's why people have such a hard time with him, in many ways. There's no nostalgia. And in a certain way, there's not hope either, I mean, for him, it's just the working through of the tragic condition of where we are, but do so in a way that is very honest to the phenomena of capitalism and this kind of domination that we've been subjected to.
A reference was
Yeah,
made
yeah.
in one of your notices regarding Ardo's class to a book by David Harvey, and I tried.
It's
to
not
Google
David
it.
Harvey, the political economist.
The
It's a
logic,
philosopher.
the logic of commodity circulation.
Yeah, he's gonna do that
Is
about 2 or
related
3
to what
weeks.
we're talking about, or something different? I don't know. I'd like to read it because I studied capital with him, with David Harvey.
No, this is not the David Harvey you're thinking of.
It's a
It's
different.
another, David L. Harvey is this
Oh,
guy.
it's a different
He's
David,
in
a
Nevada,
different Harvey.
University of Nevada.
Okay.
Right?
Thank
He's
you.
a different philosopher.
Too bad for him.
I thought it was my David.
No, it's not your David Harvey, or your Rick Wolf, right?
My David
Both of whom I
Harvey is
admire
special.
very, very deeply, but it's another David Harvey. And it's a very interesting piece. We do a section on method on Wednesday nights before, to go.
Thank you for
Yeah,
clearing that
no, it's
up.
David L. Harvey.
It's a different.
David L. Yeah. He's a philosopher at the University of Nevada. Yeah, and it's a very interesting piece written in the 90s for the Philosophical Forum, which is the Graduate Center Philosophy Journal, CUNY Philosophy Journal, in which, it's a very good piece, in a way. There's also, if you're interested in Hegelian studies, which I am, I mean, there's also an edition on the young Hegelians, how after Hegel's death, there became schools around Hegel, so, and how this emerged, from Marx, in many ways. Marx is not possible without Hegel, I mean, in a way. You can't just bypass it, but you have these struggles in the movement. And I'm just trying to make us aware that it's not so simple that Marx was just Hegelian, or there are Kantian moments, as the Coletti and Della Volpe schools have shown us. Althusser has a very Kantian moment with Marx as well, and Spinoza's moment. The Spinoza's Marxists, Hegelian Marxists, they're Cartesian Marxists. There's a guy named Kelman in, Kirchner in France, who does wonderful things with Descartes in terms of social thinking, in terms of the method, the discourse on the method, which is not dialectical. But Marx is also using deductive systems, too. Marx is not just, quote, dialectical. This is, again, an academic game, right, in a way. It's a board game. What is dialectics, right? We stop here, get out of dialectics card reconciled free or whatever. You can do a board game on this, in a sense. So, there's deductive systems. This is a massive thinker at work, to put it mildly, the world was not ready, yet, for this kind of thinking, It's like Heidegger with being. It'll probably take 200-300 years to figure out what he really meant by being and being in the world ultimately. Or really about being. And Marx, you have to read this stuff time and time again, exactly. So, we live in an era, we're commentators, really. Even the best people out there are commentators. Originality is no longer, we're still reverberating from German Romanticism, German Hegelianism, German Marxism, German physics, etc.
Some of us are chipmunks.
Something like that, yeah. Okay.
So you wouldn't say there's any original thinking right now?
Well, I don't see, it depends on what you mean by original, but it seems to me that the codes are all in place and that there's commentary and there's a kind of an extension. To me, the original thinkers on the planet right now, or at least attempts, are Bernard Stiegler in France, a person who kind of really thinks through technology in a very rigorous way, in a very different way. And to a lesser degree, although he comes more out of the tradition, Alain Badiou in France, who being in an event, he's written 3 ontologies, The Immanence of Truths is another one, and logical, Logic and Logical Worlds. Three books on ontology. The ontology of Stiegler is 5 volumes, Technics and Time. So these are kind of people that are really attempting to break open the other stuff, but the rest of the stuff is pretty much commentary. The question is, how do we basically begin? We're on the cusp, if you will, still. It's too early. We're on this switch to technocratic capitalism from industrial capitalism that we've been going through for some time. How is it possible to really think this, in such an immediate way? It's going to take time. But there are 2 people. I think particularly Stiegler is one who does this. And then there are people who are doing. Catherine Malabou to me is very interesting. The ontology of the accident. She has a very good book on Hegel too. She's an original thinker in her way. She's trying to bridge the gap between ontology and neurology. Because a lot of the advances being done in terms of neurological, brain science, and this kind of stuff. But for the most part, we're reading, we're rereading, we're commenting, we're taking some of the insights, we're trying to understand, and then we, try to orient ourselves vis-a-vis this and open it up to, what's happening today. Trump is obviously farce, but it's a very serious farce. And maybe pastiche, maybe even lesser form, literary form of pastiche. What do we make of a guy that's doing, these Twitter characters 140 times yesterday? He's replying, and he's at an international conference of financiers in Davos. 140 Twitters he sent out yesterday.
But it's also because
Wow.
the Marxist tradition is a tradition of critique as well, right?
Yes.
And so, you know, there's originality, but it's in this.
Well,
it's in this-
I mean, I just don't know how much more critique
Yeah.
we have.
True.
I mean, in a way, the question would be the positive destruction, but where do you get there in terms of the ruthless criticism of everything existing?
Right.
How do you get to the new episteme, knowledge formations, or how do you get to the new paradigms? That to me is the question,
Right.
in a sense. I mean, the new paradigms are been in place since the 1920s. We haven't really thought,
Yeah.
beyond Weimar and, the philosophy of the 20s in some ways,
We
Yeah.
lost 100 years, so we're going back to.
Yeah, well, I mean,
Back it up.
there are two essays that are interesting, in terms of temporality for me. Zizek and the talk he gave for us at BMCC that were before World War I, were before Sarajevo, right, before the assassination of the Archduke, in some ways because of the global picture and what's been going on. And, it is free fall, Wild West show capitalism at work, in a way. I mean, with maybe different levels of regulation. And the other part is of the 30s before us, in a sense, because of the fundamental, moments, because we've been through this, quote, economic upswing, since Reagan, in a way. When is this going to break? Is this going to break? We've had little elements, 89 we had a crash, we had the crash of 89, we had the agent contagion of 98, and then we had the financial meltdown. 9/11 created something for about, a year and a half, but the other one was the big financial meltdown of 2008-9. But generally speaking, you have had for the middle classes, right, for the affluent classes, no economic downturn that really lasted, even though there have been big recessions, etc. Yeah. So this is something that we have to look at. Is there new forms of regulation that are keeping this held together when there's nothing but chaos underneath it? We all know this. We all intuit it. It's not, it doesn't take, Einstein to figure out that there's, something, going on.
Some people
Tremendous
say
things.
that capitalism is coming to a full stop. The economists are saying that, not so much philosophers.
Right.
Now the
I don't buy that for a second.
Well, already
Yeah.
Europe is in negative interest rates already 5 years, no growth.
Yes, I know.
So how do you have capitalism without growth?
You have capitalism without growth because the capitalists are still making off. Paribas, BNP Paribas, the banks, they're all making out, Yeah.
Yeah, but no private investments happening. I mean, a lot of things are.
Well, they have the
getting-
colonies still too.
They have.
They have extraction. Bernard Henri Lévy's family is rubber merchants in Africa. They're still extracting, surplus from there.
Yeah, but how?
Look at Apple Computer. Apple Computer is a bank. They have something like $60 billion in cash on hand. Just cash on hand.
That's another thing, like
Right,
piles
right.
of
How
cash,
does this
but
happen?
nothing moving.
All the offshore money that's sitting out there, the derivatives markets that are based on, algorithms that nobody's going to figure out how to unwind, et cetera, which is creating more and more liquidity. And that's really the crisis, would be the liquidity crisis. The blood no longer flows, to use an image, right, in a sense, but the liquidity is there. I don't buy the argument that capitalism is on its, that the contradictions are so great that it's ready to collapse. I think you have to make it collapse. I think Marx understood that too, very much. That's why they had the movement.
How do you make it collapse?
Well, that's a good question. Yeah.
Well, Marx was,
Yeah.
predicting that once capitalism, in a way, comes to full stop, that's when they get better.
No, Marx said that the revolution would take place in the most advanced countries. And it
Right,
did not.
last
It
stage
did
of
not.
capitalism.
It did not. It
But
took
we
back in
didn't have the-
agricultural,
Right.
czarist
Russia
countries,
was
and
the
it took
opposite
there
of that.
in China
But
and
that
in
was
a
not-
Caribbean island, where your three major revolutions
Right,
in
right.
the 20th century.
Yes, but that was not the real revolution. The revolution is only coming, the real revolution.
Well, I like the way you think. I welcome you to the class. But anyway,
I'd
it's
bring it
great.
back.
It's great. I appreciate it very much.
Like
I
Bernie
like
does.
it. I like it. Yeah.
Well, I come from a socialist country and I like the socialism we had, but it was only really a light experiment at best. It was not really, didn't,
Which country?
Yugoslavia.
Oh,
and
you,
again,
I didn't
yeah,
get
yeah,
it, right.
Yeah. I mean, it was the star, if you will, of
yeah, it was like
Eastern Europe.
probably the
Yeah,
best,
yeah, the best of all.
experiment
Yes.
of all experiments.
Yes, exactly. Yeah. Marshal Tito is not.
But they were not,
yeah.
all
Yeah.
experiments, all these were,
Right.
attempts at
Of course,
socialism.
of course. And educationally, the Soviet Union was really a successful experiment, for the most part. Yeah, for the most part, in terms of the education.
Well, Scandinavia.
The moment of thing. Yeah, Scandinavia in its way, yes, that's true. Yeah. But Marx always said, I mean, this is why Marx is still a kind of, he has not been disproven, because he said the revolution would take place where the workers are the most advanced. And it did not happen in England. It did not happen in the United States or France or Germany. There were attempts, obviously, right? I mean, especially in Germany, right? And, but, not in,
The book that we studied with you by Stiegler, I better start taking Predagen for my memory. Because
what's
the
that
title-
called? I'm sorry.
The title, part of the title was The Creation of Ignorance. What was the name of that?
States of shock.
Yeah. I can't- that's
Stupidity
the
and
next
knowledge in the 21st century.
one. And
States of shock.
And
He
then
takes that
the
from Naomi
subtitle-
Klein's shock, knowledge and stupidity
yeah, knowledge
in the
and
20th
stupidity.
century.
It's a magnificent book.
It is a very good book.
Because the stupidity is what holds, I don't want to sound disparaging, the stupidity.
No, it's
of-
okay.
The stupidity of the average American citizen
Right.
is what keeps us so arrested. Why it's not fashionable, it is now, thank goodness, to mention the word socialism and to avoid calling yourself liberal, that's too far to the left, call yourself a progressive. We have a lot of stupidity in our culture, all pervasive.
It's everywhere. It's
Well,
not
It's
unique to
everywhere.
this
It's not only
Well, I
here,
think
but
it's a
it's
human
Let me just say
condition.
this
It's a little
about
more intensified.
something that Marcuse said about the school system. Marcuse said in 1978, this is close to now 41 years ago, 42 years ago, he said that the American program in education is the systematic moronization of its people.
Yeah, that's
Marcuse
what I'm
said,
trying to say.
and then Stanley and
That's
I,
true.
we basically say what education is in the United States. We came up with this phrase: is organized planned ignorance.
Right.
Organized planned ignorance,
At
not
best-
planned economy,
At best,
but planned
it's training,
ignorance.
it's training to make a living, at best.
Well, that's another thing. You have to make a distinction between schooling and education. What is schooling? Schooling is training. Most of my students, I'm here, professor, to get a job. I said, you can go get a job without schooling. What are you sitting in this stupid classroom for? For all this time. Yeah.
Meanwhile,
So what does it mean? Yeah.
liberal arts education only in this country, the concept existing, that
what?
was liberal arts, a concept of liberal arts education.
Yeah.
It's only in this country. In
Well, but I mean,
in
look.
Europe, you get it in your high school. You don't
Right,
go
the
for liberal arts
lycée,
degree.
is the equivalent of basically a lot of master's programs in literature now in the United States. If you go to a lycée, a good lycée in France, for example, or maybe in Serbia too, by the time you come out, especially in France, that lycée training has given you enough, background and ability to think, like the equivalent of a master's in literature in the United States.
And lycée is a high school.
The high school,
I
yeah,
can
from that
I
side.
think about Henry Miller's book, Miracle at Colossus. In the first paragraph, Henry Miller, the first duty of an American is to go to Paris so he can become a human being.
That's right,
The next
I need to
thing
go to Paris.
is to go to Athens so you can look yourself in the mirror.
that's right. The Colossus of, it was one of the islands, right?
Yeah.
Marusi, yeah.
Well, I went to all those places. I
You did?
lived in the
Okay.
house where
Okay.
Henry Miller lived
Yeah,
when I
yes.
went there.
Very smart man, yeah. He wrote a book about America called The Air-Conditioned Nightmare.
About right.
That's wonderful.
Yeah. Really great book. Only place he liked in America was New Orleans. Only place.
Well,
He
I'm
hated
glad
it.
I'm here in America, the Bernie Sanders moment. What can I say?
Oh, God.
Okay, well.
Where did he come from? He's like a descendant.
I know.
Oh,
This is
boy.
one of, you know, I
Okay,
think.
well, I'm glad, yeah. We'll get into it later. Yeah. I'll wait till you're here a few seconds before we start talking about Bernie policies and all that, yeah. But I mean, I'm for it. I mean, given what we
should
have.
just take one step at a time because I
Yeah.
think any change at this moment is a good change because what at this moment what we consider as impossible once
Yeah.
we cross a certain line and what's
Let's
previously
do this
imagined-
dialectically, though.
Yeah, what's previously being imagined as impossible is now possible. So the word socialism, 5 years ago was a dirty word, but now it's actually okay to actually say
You
it.
think it's okay?
I mean, in
think
parts
so.
of the country.
I think we're still in McCarthyism myself.
But let's look at this dialectically since it came up, right, in a sense. When you really look at the program, is Bernie Sanders, really socialist oriented, or is this a variant, if you will, on the New Deal? What is the difference between his moment? Are we in a stasis in the dialectic that we're going back, 90 years in principle to these things, right? Through a Sanders campaign. I'm not against it. I mean, any little step forward is something. But think about this dialectically in a way, historically dialectically. Is there been really development since then in terms of the programs, right? So for example, Social Security, which they're attacking, is a direct result of the New Deal, right? Medicare, Medicaid are direct, out of the Great Society. The only two victories that the workers really had in the 20th century. What he wants to do is protect those gains. Fair enough, yes, going forward. But what is beyond that? What is the new Green Deal about, right? What does this really mean, this kind of language, in a sense? Because socialism, in terms of its definition and its working concepts, is taking over the means of production by the workers. Nobody's talking about
Right.
this in terms of socialism.
That's-
You see what I'm saying? I mean,
I
they're
agree,
talking about
I
a
agree, yes.
socialized medicine, if you will, and maybe a socialized,
He is talking about
No.
having the workers on the board of,
No, he was,
Yeah.
there's an article on him today about.
But think dialectically about this. This is the point of Hegel, Think about what's unfolding historically in terms of this world historical spirit. And if you have a sense of history and you know history, you begin to say, well, we're really repeating something. Have we really advanced? Have we really done this? It may be, given the circumstances, look like progress, but is it? Is it an illusion? Right, of progress at this point in terms of the development of the human being. This is just one way of thinking about it. What's that? I'm sorry.
The unhappy consciousness.
The unhappy consciousness. That worked.
I
Going
think-
back to the text. I know we haven't been in the text.
It's okay.
But we have new people to
We
come.
don't have to do it.
We have new people that don't have the text with.
Exactly. We should
But
probably-
you've got to bring the text next time.
He read the book.
Yeah, bring the book. Okay. But go ahead. What were we going to say?
Oh yeah, I agree. It's a repetition, but I think the circumstance is dramatically different because the unfolding of the world historical spirit is the materialization of the globalization of capital. So in a way, in a very
But you don't see capital as being globalized back then? I mean, in the 1930s, you don't see the relations between Ford and the Third Reich?
Yeah.
The Krupp family
well-
and the Pentagon?
Right, I can-
All of these things are going on at the
Yes,
same
yes.
time. It's not like globalization may have accelerated, and it's much easily done in these days because of the communication
Right.
nexus.
I can only
Yeah.
say that capital back then was not able to see capital itself as globalized, but capital today is actually able to effectively move itself on a globalized level. So the step forward, of course, is to on a symbolic level redouble this movement. And so we're thinking of a sort of a global agency that quote unquote rationally organizes the movement of this globalized capital. So in a way, it's a sort of reaffirmation of the.
So we need to
global
form the
movement.
Fifth International. We need principles
Sure,
for the
but
Fifth
I
International.
think this Fifth International doesn't come out of the blue because
No,
it has,
we're with that.
yeah, it has to sort of, to emerge in response to certain crisis. And I think Bernard's program perhaps could be like the first baby step.
Yes, I
Okay.
So I'm just,
Keep
I
on
sound very
narrowing.
moderate, I sound very.
We have very good
progressive.
friends.
I don't-
We know.
I don't want to, just jump way
Yeah.
ahead and just
Yeah.
think about, what's going to take over and, establish the gulag and then, and so on and so forth. No, I think any change is good change, really.
Right, right,
Because, like, in this climate,
yeah.
to think is already a crime. in a
Okay,
sense.
but again, going back to Hegel and the movement of the dialectic, if you're in the antagonistic dialectical moment, you're really thinking outside of this and saying nothing but short of revolution is going to make the change. You're basically saying that reform movement and a kind of reconciliatory dialectic
it is
is the step. I'm just
Yes,
You're like-
but so,
the
so-
old reform
so the-
revolution debate.
Yeah.
So the key,
Quantitative
is
changes
to
to the
think
qualitative.
what it actually means to exercise revolution. So that is in itself is also a question,
Right.
and going back to this the topic of the highly repressive intellectual and anti-intellectual and political climate, to think and to imagine any sort of a heteronomy is already a revolutionary gesture
Okay.
in a sense.
Mhm.
So that's why.
Well, I'm not,
Well, acting is a revolutionary gesture.
yeah.
Thinking. How about thinking? How about we say thinking is acting?
Well, okay. Right. Sure.
Well, thinking as acting, right?
Right.
I mean, that thinking as active process,
Right.
Yes.
not just dead weight.
So the
or-
gesture
you
with
know,
so the gesture of
we've been through this many times, in history, as you know. I mean, we've had dialectical movement at a standstill. I mean, if we were really living through a dialectical, development at this point, we would have schools, we would have a completely different society. This is the point. The point is that the dialectic is interrupted.
Yeah.
The dialectic is brought to a standstill because, by many, many forces. I mean, including the philosophical forces of positivism, facticity, regression, immediate pragmatics. All of these things play into putting this to a halt,
Netflix.
right? To a halt. So the question is, yes, how do you restart, in some ways? And is it enough? That's another question too. Is it enough? Yeah. Is it enough? Yeah.
is it even possible to think what it is enough?
Well, that's a good question too. I mean, it's like Kant, where we can't imagine God, so why waste our time? Right, something like that. I'm very much paraphrasing there, but yeah. No, I hear you. I mean, I hear you about this, but this is an old debate. I mean, in a way. I mean, again, we're recasting something from 1917, 1918.
Yeah.
We're really recasting. I mean, it's a very interesting thing. We're doing Lenin and Luxemburg. We're doing Luxemburg versus the Social Democrats.
Yeah.
And the Social Democrats ended up killing the militants, which
They
is
did,
a
yeah.
sad mark on their history.
For co-ops.
Yeah, for co-ops, for Karl Liebknecht and Rosa Luxemburg are killed in the
Let's not
name
forget.
of, in the name of social democracy. And I'm not so sure that's a good thing, social democracy in a way. Yeah, in some ways.
Social democracy is the only thing we can be nostalgic about.
I'm not nostalgic for social.
Okay, for some.
Yeah, I mean, yeah.
It was it was a great achievement in the West after World War II, and it was something that actually worked.
Well, there's a lot of schools of thought on that too, since we're trying to do some dialogue. There's also, the opposition there would be the Marshall Plan and how much that, then the Lend-Lease agreements after the war, and how much Germany was built up by design, not because, and you have to remember, part of the world's process after 1945 never let those two countries unite again, right? It's only after the fall of the wall that was allowed, and that they knew the fall of the Soviet Union was fairly imminent, that was allowed to happen. Remember that. I mean, that's a very, very crucial story, I think, World War II. How did Germany become rebuilt? It wasn't because they were a socialist country, the West Germany. In fact, East Germany had the highest level of productivity in the world per hours in terms of production, right?
Okay.
Yeah, I
I
mean,
didn't know
really,
that.
and all, yeah, I mean, you know, in a sense. So, I mean, there are histories here that have been suppressed, right? The country that shit, I mean, you know, in terms of what they did there too, I mean, you know, remarkable, right? Yeah, everybody's fixated only on the Prague Spring, right, in Czechoslovakia, right, or the invasion of Hungary. But you have many other moments in the eastern countries that were very, very fertile, you know, in a way, yeah, very fertile, right? So, you know, and plus, you know, all these people talking about it, and our friend Arto too, I mean, this whole thing about cybernetics, you have people making fun of this and writing satirical novels. Most of the best ones are coming out of places like Czechoslovakia, you know, Serbia and other places. These novelists are very well aware of what this new world order based on cybernetics is about. So I think it's a difficult question. I'm not nostalgic for social democracy. I'm really not, you know, or the New Deal in a way. I mean, you know, I think it's important to put it into a perspective. You know, did it really rebuild after World War II, you know, what we wanted, right? Remember, the German student movement, SDS in Germany, and Al knows this, in the 1960s was one of the most powerful. Luke Hoch was their mentor to German SDS in 1960, right? You read books, listen, we read books about, you know, the Age of Desire and stuff like that. But Michael Schneider in Germany is writing Neurosis and Class Struggle, right? Very different approaches to Freud in the light of Marxism in some ways. You know, very different kind of attempts here. Very, very important, you know, to see. So I just want us to be careful. I mean, if we're going to think, you know, I mean, look, it's a class on Hegel and reason and, you know, revolution, to think about this, you know, really in terms of dialectics, right? I don't think one's better than the other. I agree with you. We need a baby step, and maybe feel the burn is that baby step, right?
But you know,
right? In many ways. Yeah, yeah.
This
I mean,
is-
what else do we have? I agree with you. You know, I mean, on
We
the
never
national
achieved a
scene.
just society, that's
No, no,
another
no,
thing.
I
I mean,
don't-
social democracy, socialism,
Yeah.
I
politics.
just wonder what time you're
We're going to be here about another 10, 15 minutes. Yeah, thank you.
What'd you say?
That we never achieved a just society in any of these.
Whoever did.
Nobody.
hasn't
Nowhere
been
on
done
the humanity hasn't
Maybe the
arrived at it.
kibbutz.
And maybe we will not even achieve
For
a
when you're
just society.
14. Yeah.
No, you know, I like northern Spain with the anarcho-socialists, anarchists, the
Yeah.
anarchists.
Yeah.
There's a couple of, there's more than a couple of wonderful essays written about what life was like. It was paradise.
Right.
They had authors living there when it was a pure anarchism. But the tracks I read on that, the people who invented it, they made cellular movements. You know, everybody. There was no main structure.
Centralized structure.
Yeah, it was wonderful. They said it was
Right.
just wonderful, and that's why they had to be destroyed.
You know, but Marx in the end was an anarchist. Marx thinks we would get, part of the beauty of Marx is that once you get to the point of where we can govern ourselves, there's no need for a state.
Right.
This is the whole thing of the state withers away. You know, in the transitional period, we need the state. But ultimately, Marx is an anarcho-communist, right? Yeah, he's not,
That's true.
not quote unquote, just, you know, yeah.
Marx was not a Marxist.
Well, he said that. You know,
He's not a
he said that in French. No, he said that. They asked him, "Are you a Marxist?" He said, "I'm not a Marxist." I'm Marx. No, I'm not a Marxist.
Just to go back to the
Yeah, yeah,
social
sure.
democracy
Yeah,
for a
yeah,
second too. I mean, I think it's interesting in this context of Hegel specifically because,
Right.
you know, and that's what I was trying to point to with the
Right.
break of Marx in a sense is
Right.
that there were many Hegelian social democrats, essentially,
Right.
Feuerbach, etc., that sort of positioned themselves, you know, with sort of these socialist tenets. But Marx made a decisive break, according to
Tremendous.
Althusser, or whoever you want.
Yeah, no, not only Althusser.
Right.
Many people in terms of the counter-Feuerbachian moment.
Right.
Right?
Which-
I mean, the traditional materialism is critiqued as early as 1843 and 1844 in the thesis on Feuerbach. That the sensuous traditional materialism,
Mm-hmm.
it was not hardcore materialism, would not make it. He criticizes him.
Right.
And this is where the famous Thesis 11, hitherto philosophers have only interpreted the world. The point, however, is to transform it. And what does that really mean? That process of transformation.
Yeah.
And this is why Hegel, like today's reading, which we never really get to,
We'll do it
but
next
anyway,
time.
we'll get to it next time,
Yeah.
is about these consciousnesses, right, that play out historically, that are transformative consciousnesses on the way to reason. And then the question is, should we be positioning our minds? I can see it, listen, if you're sitting in the position of reason, Hegelian and then Marxist reason, you see a Bernie Sanders, as Nathan says, a baby step, a very small baby step, right? But needs to be critiqued, because without the critique, you're not going to have a movement.
Yep.
You know what I mean? He's not the end all, the be all, or hallelujah, we're going to jump up like cheerleaders. You know what I mean?
No, but that's what he's saying too.
Yeah, yeah.
It's not me, it's us. It's a movement. It has to be
Right.
a lot of people starting to
Right.
get.
Right. We have to look at the program very carefully. See, Bernie doesn't talk about Social Security and how it's not kept up with inflation. How many elderly people, he wants to
is.
save Social Security, but...
And expand it.
Yeah, okay.
That's his-
How much percentage?
He's talking
I'm
about-
interested.
We'll get
I'm
there
just
later.
kidding, yeah.
Well, I mean, he's talking about decommodification. We have to decommodify basic things. We have to talk in terms of human
Yes,
rights.
of course. Okay.
Instead of being consumers,
Yeah,
how
yeah.
about we talk about
Right.
health as a human right,
Right.
rather than, oh, I am a consumer, I'm gonna buy this insurance or that.
Right.
Let's step
No, of
out
course,
of that.
of
Let's
course.
decommodify air, let's decommodify water we drink, let's decommodify the grid, let's decommodify the internet.
Right.
If we decommodify a lot of things, we can be much happier humans
Right.
and focus on, other things.
I hope so.
Like
Leisure.
architecture.
Leisure.
I wish my profession will revive itself, become
Mm-hmm.
again a profession, because right now it's not.
No, I know, yeah. Trump put a friend of mine out of business, by the way. A big firm in New York. He owed him $3 million and he never paid it. And during the
You can-
financial
Oh, shit.
crisis, they went under because they didn't have this money on hand.
It cannot exist without
Sick.
a public domain. It cannot be
Well,
only
of
private
course,
hands.
Yeah. We'll send you an article. A friend of ours wrote a thing on Red Vienna, the architecture of Red Vienna recently. I gotta get it, we'll put it up. Dennis Bro wrote something good about this, that architecture. You read Tarfudi, Manfredo Tarfudi? It's very good, right, yeah, these are really good people, yeah.
The end of architecture is.
Yes.
What's the name of it?
Manfredo Tarfudi was an Italian architect and theorist, yeah, very, very solid work.
What?
Tafuri.
Tarfuti.
Tarfudi,
Furi.
yes.
Tafuri. It sounds kind of Japanese, but
Yeah,
it's
yeah.
kind of.
Yeah. So it's interesting. So you want to go, we can go to the text for 5 minutes, maybe, just to look, and then you guys can, try to catch up on the YouTube,
Yeah.
and I'll try to go back and forth, but we did a lot of work, through the first, session.
What should?
Well, I'd like us for next time to go back to self-consciousness. You're going to begin with where Kojève begins in place of an introduction, the truth of self-certainty, self-consciousness, and I would focus both on the master-slave dialectic, and I'm going to point out two crucial propositions here. 189 and 190 are crucial for understanding mastery and the master, in the master-slave dialectic.
180, 180.
189 and 190. And this is on page 115 in the Miller translation. And he says, particularly about becoming the double game of the immediate consciousness, but also being constituted as an object, as a thing, together. That you have this double movement going on as a master. You understand the immediacy of where you are, but at the same time you understand how you're constituted as an object, as a thinghood, right? These are two moments in this process. which we really don't think of in terms of ourselves often. So this doppelganger, the double, is always working, this double self-consciousness, that you consider yourself both a thing, a subject, and an object, to use another kind of language, right, in this case. So then the being for self, right, in 191, the Lord is the consciousness that exists for itself, but no longer is a notion anymore, not a concept, it's an actuality. Rather, it is a consciousness existing for itself, which is mediated through itself through another consciousness, through a consciousness whose nature is to be bound up with an existence as independent or thinghood in general. So he has this level of the other is also constituting us. And the famous saying of Rimbaud, and this is something worth thinking about vis-a-vis Hegel, I am another, right?
Je suis un.
We. Right? This is Arthur Rimbaud, the great symbolist poet. You know, it's the other that constitutes you from the outside. And it's the double movement of you being for yourself and being constituted as an object by the other. And one of the great philosophical phenomenological analysis of this, to my mind, I mean, I read too much, but anyway, the being in nothingness, the section Sartre has on concrete relations with others, when he talks about two lovers as two hypnotists going at each other, because they're always objectifying each other in the battle between each other, trying to win the love or win the mastery of the love. It's a very beautiful section. And he also speaks about the relationships of bad and good faith in this concept. And part of bad faith is you don't understand yourself as an object or as thinghood. You know, you only understand yourself as, quote, the human or the person. And to me, this is a difference between, in some ways, politically speaking, I'm just going to throw this out very speculatively, but it's the difference between the social democrat and the communist. The communist will understand this. The social democrat wants the human, only the subject, right? Right? When you talk about decommodification, for example, that's a social democratic principle. Right? I mean, ultimately, yes, of course, we want to rid the world of those commodities, or we want commodities only as use value and not exchange value. But anyway, so this is very important to an understanding of Hegel in terms of the lordship in bondage and the master-slave. Very, very important to understand. I am je suis un autre.
I think it was Je est un autre, deliberately using the third person singular, I think.
To see what?
I don't remember.
Je est, I think.
It's the infinitive et.
Oh, okay.
EST.
Oh, okay.
It sounds bad in English. I is another, but with an autre, you.
Oh, it's not the sweet?
Yeah,
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
I got you.
Replace
Okay,
it.
okay.
I
We-
don't remember that.
But it's a good place to start, actually. Maybe we should just start in the beginning of lordship and bondage.
Yeah, I think it's a good place to begin again.
Yeah, because
yeah.
then you get the dialectic.
You get the dialectic at work
Yeah.
between the master-slave dialectic and then the shapes of consciousness.
Right.
So to preview this a bit, we would go through, you would start on page, in the Miller translation, and I suggest you use that because that's what we're all using here. You would look at the truth of self-certainty. I wouldn't take that, I would really look at 178. Independence and dependence of self-consciousness, lordship and bondage. This is on
Yeah.
page 111.
Yeah.
111, right? Proposition 178. When I put some 178, it's the proposition because Miller did it like Hegel did in propositional form, right? So we would read 178 and we would read all the way to the end if you can. And just to preface this, he's going to go through this very long description, critical, analytical moment of the master-slave, the dialectic of history, right? Here in the master-slave dialectic, and we'll talk a little bit about this in terms of some of the ramifications. And then he goes into the three distinct historical shapes of consciousness. The first being Stoicism, right? Skepticism, and then ultimately the unhappy consciousness, which is the Judeo-Christian. And this is the pivotal chapter in which you go into reason, which is the next section, observing reason.
So it's
we-
like a little historical accounting
Yeah.
of the process of.
processes of the
dialectical-
dialectical thinking
Right.
that the Stoic withdraws,
Right.
and accepts. It's an active acceptance, but there's a withdrawal in work. It's not adequate to the movement towards reason. The skeptic gets lost in the double doubting and all of this going on, can get lost in the paradoxes and in the tension of the contradictions, right? The unhappy consciousness is part of the transitional moment, right? And this section ends on page 138, and it ends with 230, the sacrifice, right? Yeah. The third is the mediator, right? The third is the mediator. Now, of course, going back to what Josh said, you can read in the unhappy consciousness, dialectically, the whole Trinitarian formula in volume 3 of Capital, land, labor, and capital, as a substitute for God, the Son, and the Holy Spirit here, right? In many ways, right? And the mediations that go on. So the Trinitarian church, that's a difference in the dialectic in
Right.
terms of the
Marxism.
posit and the materiality of that, you know, in the third volume of Capital, which is called the Trinitarian formula, of which very few ecological thinkers, they look at to a degree, but they don't really think it dialectically. My friend John Clark is working on this somewhat, you know, the dialectical approach to the ecological horizon. You know, unless you look at land and labor and capital together, right? You can't just say it's bad for the environment, or we're doing this environment, or this chemical's bad because this drinking water is bad. This is nonsense to a good, you know, a good Marxist, if you will. You have to think of this relationally, right? What's happening to the soil? What's happening in the erosion of the soil? What's going on at that level? What labor is being used on it? What kind of labor? What kind of equipment, et cetera, et cetera. What kind of capital is moving? How is it capitalized, et cetera. You know, to go back to this whole thing, and maybe we should stop there because they're going to be,
Yeah,
the police are here. Anyway, we you know, need to think through in some ways. You know, do we really have a chance if we're just mitigating in terms of the climate change, right? I mean, is the regulation going to be enough? I don't think so. No. You know, you have to really think this through. So again, it raises this question of revolution versus, you know, reformist tendencies. You know, and what do we take? The giant leap forward, to use a previous, you know, model, the great leap forward comes from the, you know, the Greeks. Aesop's fables in Chinese. I'm sorry.
I didn't know that.
Yeah.
Well, but is it even okay to risk what Hegel might call infinite judgment to say that reform is revolution?
Well, you know, the most interesting person who does this is Andre Gortz, who I think people should read more of. He has a concept called revolutionary reforms. So the privileging going back, the Medicare, you know, the Social Security, these things, the protection of these things, guaranteed income, are really part of revolutionary reforms. It's not a revolutionary overthrow, but it's part of reforms that could be considered revolutionary. And I wish the Sanders language, after he's elected, anyway, I don't think it's going to happen. But anyway, I hope, I'm sorry. Yeah.
What about
Oh, the optimist.
Yeah, I like this.
No,
I like
I'm
it.
not an optimist.
What about reformist revolution? That's
Well, I don't
a
know what you
different.
mean. Tell
That's
me.
a different formulation. That's
Well, he talks about revolutionary reforms on the way to revolution.
But-
It's just sometimes we're in a war of position in Gramscian's terms.
But-
We're in the war of education right now.
Reform
That's
is-
where we are. I hate to say, he's Italian, he knows, right? The Italians are always really good at this. We're in the war of position. We don't have the ammunition for the war of maneuver. How many guns did you see on the left on MLK Day in Virginia?
Right.
How many people were out there with rifles and then, you know, hammer and sickles on their leather jackets?
Well, would you like to see that?
Well, I mean, I'm not so sure it would be the worst thing because it sets up a showdown. I don't know if it's I want to see it.
No,
I
you
have a
don't
desire
want
for that. No, I don't
a
have a
revolution
desire for
that
that.
our age cannot be through. those.
No, no, okay, I understand,
And that,
okay.
that woman who was run over by the car.
That was in Charlottesville.
Yeah,
here,
Charles,
yeah.
they called her a
Yeah.
communist. She probably was not.
Right.
She was just,
No.
yeah.
Or they called her a
They called
communist.
her. well,
She can be
naturally.
moderate
I mean,
communist.
she deserves, she deserves to die.
Revolution will happen to talking to people.
What?
Okay,
One
I'm
person
done,
at a time.
okay, okay.
We don't
Anyway,
watch
my friend-
all the Netflix, so we can see all the